The church bells rang slowly across the hills, each heavy note settling over the Moretti estate like a promise that nothing would ever be the same again. Black luxury cars lined the long stone driveway. Men in tailored suits stood shoulder to shoulder, speaking in lowered voices. Women dressed in black carried bouquets of white lilies, their faces hidden behind dark sunglasses. Despite the cloudy afternoon, everyone had come to honor Alessandro Moretti, the man who had built an empire. The father of the most feared mafia boss in New York. Inside the chapel, silence carried more weight than grief. Damian Moretti stood in the front row, motionless beside his father's polished mahogany casket. At 6'4", dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, he looked carved from granite. A faint tattoo disappeared beneath the collar of his white shirt, the only visible reminder of the dangerous world everyone associated with his name. He had spent the last 8 months overseas, settling conflicts that threatened the stability of the family's business. He had returned only 48 hours earlier, too late to hear his father's final words, too late to say goodbye. The priest's voice echoed softly through the chapel, but Damian barely heard it. Instead, his eyes wandered across the crowd, executives, family friends, old allies, household staff, and then her, Grace. She stood quietly near the last row, almost hidden behind a marble pillar. She wore a simple black dress, no expensive jewelry, no dramatic makeup. Her hands rested calmly in front of her, holding a single white lily to everyone else. She looked like another member of the household staff, paying her respects. No one looked at her twice. No one knew she was Mrs. Grace Moretti. 3 years earlier, Damian had slipped a simple wedding band onto her finger inside a tiny chapel where only one priest had witnessed their vows. No photographers, no guests, no celebration, only promises. Promises that suddenly felt very far away. Grace never looked toward him. Not once. Her eyes remained fixed on the casket. There had been a time when she could recognize Damian's footsteps before she ever saw him. A time when silence between them felt peaceful instead of painful. Now silence had become a wall. Neither of them seemed able to climb. Damian noticed something else. Her wedding ring was gone. His heartbeat paused. She had never taken it off. Not even while arranging flowers in her little shop. Not while gardening. Not while baking bread. On quiet Sunday mornings, she used to twist it gently whenever she became nervous. Now her left hand was bare. The priest finished the final blessing. People slowly began filing outside into the cool afternoon air. Grace waited until nearly everyone had left before placing her lily beside the casket. She whispered something too quietly for anyone else to hear. Then she turned away. Damian watched her disappear through the chapel doors. For reasons he couldn't explain, an uneasy feeling settled deep inside his chest. Something was wrong, very wrong. Outside, gray clouds drifted across the sky. The funeral guests gathered beneath white tents while servers quietly offered coffee. Business conversations had already begun replacing condolences. Power rarely paused for grief. Damian answered handshakes automatically. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a remarkable man. The family stands with you." He nodded without hearing most of the words. His attention drifted again. Where was Grace? He finally spotted her walking toward the far end of the parking area, not toward the mansion. Toward her old sedan. She opened the trunk. Damian frowned. Inside sat a single vintage suitcase. Not large, not new, just one carefully packed suitcase. She lifted it gently, as though everything she still owned fit inside. His pulse quickened. Grace wasn't going somewhere. For the afternoon she was leaving. Without thinking, Damian excused himself from another conversation and crossed the parking lot. The sound of polished shoes against wet pavement caught Grace's attention. She looked up. For the first time that day, their eyes met. The distance between them felt far greater than the few yards separating them. "Grace," his voice was calm. Too calm. She offered a polite smile that never reached her eyes. "You're busy. I can spare a minute." Neither moved. Wind stirred a loose strand of her chestnut hair across her face. She tucked it behind one ear. The familiar gesture struck Damian harder than he expected. How many months had it been since he had simply watched her? Really watched her. "You came alone?" he asked. "Yes." "You should have waited inside. I didn't want attention." That answer sounded exactly like Grace. Quiet, gentle, always trying to make life easier for everyone else. Damian looked toward the suitcase, then back at her. "Going somewhere." A tiny pause. "Yes." "For how long?" She lowered her eyes. "I don't know." Those 3 words unsettled him more than any threat ever had. He took another step. "You didn't tell me. I didn't think it mattered." The sentence landed like cold steel. For a brief second, Damian almost asked the question he had carried across continents. Did I do something wrong? Instead, years of practice control kept his face unreadable. If you're upset because I stayed away longer than planned, she shook her head. No. If someone said something, again, she shook her head. No. Then what is this? Her fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. She seemed tired, not physically, emotionally. Like someone who had spent months carrying invisible weight. I've been thinking for a long time about leaving, about accepting reality. Damian searched her face for the warmth he remembered. It was still there, hidden, buried beneath quiet disappointment. He suddenly realized she looked thinner. Her smile had changed. Even her posture seemed different. How had he missed all of this? Because you weren't here. The thought arrived uninvited. Behind them, funeral guests continued talking. No one paid attention to everyone else. This was merely the employer speaking to someone from the household. No one could imagine the truth. Damian glanced toward her bare left hand. Once more, his voice became softer. Where's your ring? Grace instinctively folded her fingers into her palm. She didn't answer. Silence stretched between them. Finally, she looked directly into his eyes. There was no anger, only sadness. I kept it on as long as I could. Damian felt something tighten inside his chest. What does that mean? She inhaled slowly. When someone wears a promise alone, she stopped herself. The rest remained unspoken. A car door slammed somewhere behind them. Neither turned. Damian reached toward the suitcase, not to stop her, but simply to understand. Grace, she stepped back. Just one step. It felt like a mile. He had faced armed rivals without fear, negotiated impossible alliances, buried friends, survived betrayal. Yet watching his wife move one step away left him feeling completely powerless. The breeze carried the scent of lilies from the chapel. Grace closed her eyes for only a heartbeat. When she opened them again, her decision seemed settled. Damian asked the only question that truly mattered. Why are you leaving? She stared at him for several long seconds. Then, in a voice barely louder than the wind, she answered, Because I finally know why you married me. Damian's expression froze. What are you talking about? Grace's eyes filled with quiet heartbreak. You don't have to pretend anymore. Before Damian could speak again, she reached into her handbag. Slowly, carefully, she pulled out an old envelope. Its edges were worn, its paper yellowed with time. Across the front in elegant handwriting were 5 words that made the color drain from Damian's face. For Grace, never let her see this until after my funeral. Long before funerals, hidden letters, and unanswered questions, Damian Moretti met Grace Bennett because of a bouquet that was never meant for him. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning. The city had slowed beneath a curtain of spring rain, and Damian had escaped a board meeting that had stretched far longer than his patience. His driver stopped outside a small flower shop tucked between an old bookstore and a neighborhood bakery. There was nothing remarkable about the storefront. No expensive sign, no grand display. Just fresh flowers arranged with quiet care beneath a handwritten board that read, Bennett Flowers. He stepped inside only because he needed a bouquet for a hospital visit, nothing more. The soft chime above the door announced his arrival. A young woman looked up from a work table covered with white roses and eucalyptus branches. I'm sorry, she said with an apologetic smile. Give me just 1 minute. She returned to tying a ribbon around a bouquet before walking toward an elderly customer, waiting near the register. Instead of rushing, she listened. The old man explained that his wife had loved lilies for 53 years. She had passed away the previous winter. Today would have been her birthday. Grace untied the ribbon she had just finished. Without hesitation, she removed the expensive roses and replaced them with fresh white lilies. They remind people that love doesn't disappear, she said softly. The elderly man smiled through wet eyes. They were always her favorite. Grace refused the extra money he offered. Buy yourself lunch instead. Only after he left did she walk over to Damian. I'm sorry for keeping you waiting. It's fine. What can I help you find? He glanced around the shop. Every arrangement looked different. Nothing appeared copied from a catalog. Every bouquet seemed created for one specific person. I need flowers, she laughed gently. I guessed that much. For the first time in days, Damian found himself smiling. A friend is recovering after surgery. What kind of person is your friend? He hesitated. No one has ever asked me that before. Flowers should fit the person receiving them, Grace replied. Otherwise, they're only decoration. It was such a simple answer. Yet it lingered in his mind long after she began selecting pale blue hydrangeas and white orchids. She wrapped the bouquet herself. When she handed it to him, she noticed the expensive watch beneath his coat sleeve and the bodyguard waiting outside. She asked no questions. She offered no assumptions. To her, he was simply another customer. Damian paid, then paused. "What's your name?" "Grace." He nodded once. "Thank you, Grace." She smiled. "I hope your friend feels better." She never asked his name. The hospital patient recovered within weeks. The flowers lasted nearly twice as long as expected, but Damian found reasons to return to Bennett flowers. Sometimes he needed flowers, sometimes he did not. Once he bought sunflowers simply because Grace said they reminded her that hope always faced the light. Another time she explained why lavender helped grieving families feel calmer. She spoke about flowers the way musicians spoke about songs. Each carried a meaning, each told a story. Slowly, Damian began telling stories of his own. Not about the Moretti family, not about power, certainly not about the dangerous responsibilities that filled his life. Instead, he spoke about his mother, about quiet Sunday breakfasts, about learning to make coffee from his father, about the loneliness that came with always being surrounded by people. Grace listened without interrupting. She never tried to impress him. She never feared him. She simply saw the man beneath the tailored suit. And that frightened Damian more than any enemy ever had. Months passed. Their first dinner happened almost by accident. Grace had worked late preparing flowers for a charity gala. Every restaurant nearby had already closed. The bakery owner next door insisted they share the last 2 bowls of homemade soup before locking up. They laughed over burnt bread. It was simple, ordinary, completely different from Damian's carefully controlled world. When he drove her home that evening, neither wanted the conversation to end. "You're very quiet," Grace said. "I usually am." "I don't think that's true." He looked at her. "No, I think you've spent a long time believing people only want the powerful version of you." She smiled. "I like this version better." Those words followed him home. For days, perhaps weeks. The first person to notice the change was Alessandro Moretti. Damian's father had watched his son become colder every year after his mother's death. Now, something was different. "You smile again," Alessandro observed. One evening, Damian raised an eyebrow. "Do I? You didn't notice?" Alessandro chuckled. "That usually means someone else caused it." Damian tried denying it. He failed. His father listened quietly as Damian described the flower shop and the woman who never treated him differently because of his name. When Damian finished, Alessandro said only one sentence. "Protect her from this world for as long as you can." At the time, Damian believed he understood. Later, he would realize he understood almost nothing. Their wedding happened 6 months later, not because of pressure, not because of family tradition, not because of business, because neither wanted another day apart. The ceremony took place in a small countryside chapel before sunrise. Only Father Michael stood with them. Grace wore an ivory dress she had altered herself. Damian wore a charcoal suit instead of black because she once admitted she preferred seeing him in lighter colors. They exchanged simple rings. No photographers, no applause, no headlines, only vows. "I choose you," Grace whispered always. Damian answered with quiet certainty. "I'll keep you safe." Father Michael smiled. "You have chosen love in a world that often chooses fear." Neither bride nor groom imagined those words would become the greatest challenge of their marriage. Keeping the marriage secret seemed like the safest decision. Too many rival families watched Damian. Too many enemies searched for weakness. If no one knew Grace was his wife, no one could use her against him. At least, that was the plan. Grace continued running her flower shop. She occasionally stayed at the Moretti estate, where most employees believed she was simply helping with floral arrangements and charitable events. Very few people knew the truth. Alessandro, Father Michael, Damian's personal attorney, and one other person, Victoria Moretti, Damian's aunt. She smiled warmly. When Damian introduced Grace, she complimented the wedding bouquet. She even embraced her. "I've always wanted another daughter in this family." Grace believed every word. Damian noticed something different. Victoria's smile reached her lips, never her eyes. Weeks later, Damian prepared to leave for Europe on urgent family business. He promised it would only be for a short time. "I'll write every week," he told Grace. "You don't have to." "I want to." She slipped a folded note into his jacket pocket. "So will I." They kissed goodbye beneath the old oak tree outside the flower shop. Neither realized someone was watching from the second-floor window of the mansion. Victoria stood behind the curtains, her expression unreadable. That evening, after Damian's car disappeared down the long driveway, A housekeeper carried the first handwritten envelope addressed to Grace toward the front entrance. Victoria stepped into the hallway. "I'll make sure she receives it." She accepted the letter with a gracious smile. The housekeeper thanked her and walked away. Victoria waited until the hallway was empty. Then she turned the envelope over in her hands. She read the familiar handwriting. She looked toward the fireplace, and without the slightest hesitation, she slipped Damian's unopened letter into the drawer of her private writing desk. The first letter Damian wrote from Europe never reached Grace. Neither did the second or the third. Each Sunday evening, after another exhausting week of negotiations, Damian would sit alone in his hotel suite with a fountain pen and several sheets of thick cream-colored paper. He never liked emails. They felt temporary. Letters felt honest. They carried pauses, crossed out words, fingerprints, and emotions too difficult to type. In his first letter, he apologized for leaving so suddenly. In the second, he described a small cafe in Florence, where the owner insisted fresh flowers belonged on every table, because people breathe differently when beauty is nearby. He knew Grace would love that sentence. In the third, he enclosed a pressed lavender sprig between the pages. By the fourth letter, he confessed something he had never said aloud. "I miss ordinary mornings with you more than I miss home." Each envelope was addressed in his careful handwriting. Each one was entrusted to the Moretti estate. Each one disappeared before Grace ever knew it existed. Grace waited. The first week, she blamed the time difference. The second, she assumed Damian had become busier than expected. By the third, she found herself checking the mailbox every afternoon before opening the flower shop. Customers noticed her glancing toward the door each time the delivery truck stopped outside. Nothing came. Not a single letter. Not a single postcard. Only silence. Still, she defended him. "He'll write," she told Sophia one evening while sweeping fallen rose petals from the shop floor. Sophia leaned against the counter, watching her friend force a smile. "You've said that for almost a month. I know him. Do you?" Grace paused. The question lingered longer than either woman expected. "I think I do." Sophia reached across the counter and squeezed her hand. "Then trust what you know, not what you fear." Grace nodded. She wanted to believe that. She truly did. Thousands of miles away, Damian waited for a reply that never arrived. At first, he smiled each time the hotel receptionist handed him the day's mail. By the fifth week, his smile had faded. Nothing. Not one envelope. Not one handwritten note. Not even the tiny pressed flowers Grace sometimes tucked inside her letters. His assistant finally asked the question Damian refused to ask himself. Perhaps she's upset. Damian stared out the hotel window. "I promised I'd be home in 6 weeks. It's already been 8. I know." The negotiations had become impossible to leave. A rival organization had threatened several long-standing business agreements. Walking away too soon could expose innocent employees to dangerous consequences. Every delay felt justified. Every delay also carried a cost. One evening, Damian picked up the phone. "I'll call her." His thumb hovered over Grace's number. Then he lowered the receiver. It was nearly 2 in the morning in New York. Tomorrow, he thought. Tomorrow became another week, then another. Back at the Moretti estate, Victoria perfected the art of saying very little. She never directly lied. She preferred something far more convincing. Half-truths. One afternoon, Grace stopped by the mansion to arrange flowers in the library before Alessandro's scheduled medical appointment. Victoria entered, carrying a silver tea tray. "You've been working too hard." Grace smiled politely. "The roses needed replacing. They're beautiful." Victoria set down the tray. "I spoke with Damian yesterday." Grace's eyes brightened immediately. "You did? He sounded exhausted." "I'm sure he is." Victoria nodded sympathetically. "The family always comes first," Grace agreed without hesitation. "It has to." Victoria sighed, almost imperceptibly. "Sometimes I wonder if he remembers to make room for anything else." The word sounded almost accidental, almost harmless. But they settled quietly inside Grace's heart. Days later, another conversation unfolded, this time in the mansion's hallway. Grace rounded the corner carrying fresh peonies just as Victoria spoke with the family attorney. They never noticed her standing nearby. "The marriage was necessary," Victoria said. "Alessandro believed it would bring Damian stability." The attorney frowned. "I never understood why they kept it secret." "Neither did Damian." Grace froze. Her fingers tightened around the bouquet. Victoria continued in a thoughtful voice. "He respected his father's wishes. Do you think he'll continue the arrangement? I suppose that depends on whether duty still requires it." The attorney simply nodded before walking away. Grace remained hidden behind the corner long after they disappeared. Her breathing became shallow. The marriage was necessary. He respected his father's wishes. The sentences repeated inside her mind all afternoon. She never heard what Victoria had carefully avoided saying, that Damian had been the one who proposed, that Alessandro had tried to talk him into waiting, that the marriage had begun with love. Instead, Grace walked away believing she had accidentally overheard the truth. Weeks turned into months. The flower shop remained full. Grace remained lonely. She continued wearing her wedding ring. Every evening she polished it before placing her hand against the bedroom window. She imagined Damian looking at the same moon from somewhere across the ocean. Sometimes she whispered goodnight. There was never an answer. Damian finally found a single free weekend. He wandered through a centuries-old artisan market after finishing another meeting. A small jewelry shop caught his attention. Inside, an elderly craftsman displayed hand-painted music boxes. One of them was decorated with tiny white lilies. The melody reminded Damian of the old piano Grace loved listening to while arranging flowers. "I'll take this one," he said. The craftsman wrapped it carefully. Damian added a handwritten note. "For our first Sunday morning after I come home, I owe you breakfast, flowers, and far too many quiet moments." He sealed the package himself. "Please make sure this reaches my wife." "It will." Damian smiled for the first time in weeks. He imagined Grace opening the music box, imagined her laughing softly, imagined her forgiving the distance. He had no reason to believe otherwise. 3 days later, a courier delivered the elegant package to the Moretti estate. A young housekeeper accepted it with a smile. "Oh, Mrs. Grace will love this." Victoria appeared almost immediately. "I'll bring it to her." "Thank you, Mrs. Moretti." The housekeeper handed over the parcel without hesitation. Victoria waited until she was alone. She untied the ribbon, opened the lid. The delicate melody filled the silent room. For a brief moment, even she seemed moved. Then she removed Damian's handwritten note, folded it once, slipped it into the same locked drawer where dozens of unopened letters already rested. She closed the music box, walked to the flower room, and placed it on a shelf beside several charity donations. No name, no card, no explanation. That evening Grace noticed the beautiful music box among the donated items. She smiled sadly. Someone must have forgotten to collect it. She gently wound the key. As the soft melody drifted through the room, she had no idea that the man she loved had chosen it only for her. Nor did she know that hidden beneath the false bottom of the velvet-lined box was a tiny gold key that opened something Damian had been waiting his entire marriage to share with her. By the time autumn arrived, silence had settled into Grace's life so completely that it no longer felt unusual. It felt permanent. Each morning she unlocked the flower shop before sunrise. She arranged fresh lilies in the front window. She greeted customers with the same gentle smile they had always known. No one noticed that the smile disappeared the moment the last customer walked away. She had become remarkably good at hiding heartbreak. There was no dramatic collapse, no angry confrontation, only quiet acceptance. The kind that arrived after waiting too long for something that never came. At night, she returned to the Moretti estate less often. When she did, she stayed in the guest room. Instead of the bedroom she had once shared with Damian during his brief visits home, she folded her clothes carefully. She boxed small keepsakes one at a time. A favorite coffee mug, a photograph taken outside the flower shop, a knitted blanket they had bought from a street market during a rainy weekend. She never packed everything at once. That would have felt like giving up. Instead, she packed a little each week, as though leaving slowly might hurt less it didn't. Alessandro noticed. Illness had weakened his body, but not his ability to read people. One afternoon he found Grace replacing the flowers in the library. "You've chosen white roses again," she smiled softly. "You always liked them." "I do." He looked at her for a long moment. "But you don't." Grace lowered her eyes. "I've always preferred wildflowers, I know." The old man walked slowly toward the window. "When people stop choosing what they love," he paused, "it's usually because they're trying to become someone who won't be missed." Grace felt her throat tighten. "I don't understand." "I think you do." Neither said another word. Before leaving the room, Alessandro reached into his coat pocket and gently squeezed a sealed envelope. Not yet. The time wasn't right. Across the Atlantic, Damian finally boarded a flight home. The negotiations were finished. The immediate danger had passed. For the first time in months, he allowed himself to think about ordinary things. Breakfast with Grace, walking through the flower shop before opening hours, listening to her explain why she refused to throw away flowers that still had one beautiful day left. He smiled at the memory. His carry-on bag contained only a few personal belongings. The rest of the luggage space belonged to gifts, books she had once mentioned, seeds from an old botanical garden, a handmade ceramic vase, and another letter, the longest one he had written. He imagined placing everything on the kitchen table, imagined her teasing him for bringing too many flowers into a flower shop. He imagined forgiveness arriving as naturally as morning sunlight. He never imagined walking into a house already preparing for goodbye. Grace learned of Damian's return from one of the housekeepers. Mr. Moretti lands tonight. Her hands froze around a bundle of lavender. So soon? The cars are already on the way to the airport. Grace nodded. Thank you, she continued arranging flowers. Only after the housekeeper left did she quietly sit down. She had imagined this moment countless times. Sometimes she pictured herself running into his arms. Sometimes she imagined crying. Sometimes she imagined asking why he had disappeared from her life without a single explanation. Now, she felt strangely calm, because she believed she already knew the answer. She was never the love of his life. She had only been the right choice at the right time, a duty fulfilled, nothing more. The realization no longer made her angry, only tired. That evening, black subs rolled through the estate gates. Employees lined the entrance. Damian stepped out first. The long months away showed in the faint shadows beneath his eyes. He greeted the staff warmly before asking the first question on his mind. Where's Grace? The staff exchanged brief glances. She's in the greenhouse, sir. Without even entering the mansion, Damian changed direction. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the gardens, glowing softly beneath strings of warm lights. Inside, Grace was trimming the stems of white lilies. She didn't hear him immediately. He stopped just inside the doorway. For a moment he simply watched her. She looked exactly as she had in his memories. And yet, she didn't. She seemed quieter, smaller somehow, as though months of carrying invisible disappointment had slowly bent even the strongest parts of her heart. Grace, she turned. Surprise crossed her face, then composure. You're home. I am. A long silence followed. He had rehearsed dozens of things to say during the flight. None of them felt right now. I missed you. The words came out more softly than expected. Grace smiled politely. I'm glad you made it home safely. It sounded like something she would say to a customer, not to her husband. Damian took another step. I brought you something. You didn't have to. I wanted to. I already have everything I need. The sentence wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was empty. He searched her face, looking for the woman who used to laugh when he mispronounced flower names, the woman who would quietly slip her hand into his whenever they crossed a busy street. She was still standing in front of him, yet somehow she felt impossibly far away. Dinner that evening was painfully formal. Victoria welcomed Damian with perfect warmth. You look exhausted. It's been a long year. We're just grateful you're home. Grace spoke very little. Whenever Damian tried including her in the conversation, she answered kindly but briefly. He blamed himself. Of course she was hurt. He had stayed away longer than promised. He should have called more often. He should have returned sooner. He decided to give her time. He believed patience would heal what distance had damaged. He didn't realize someone had spent months convincing Grace that patience was exactly what had destroyed their marriage. Later that night, Damian entered their bedroom. Everything looked untouched. Almost. The books she usually kept beside the bed were gone. Her favorite lavender candle had disappeared. The framed photograph from their honeymoon no longer stood on the dresser. Tiny absences, easy to overlook. Unless you knew where to look, he opened the closet. Half of the space was empty. His heartbeat slowed, not from relief, from confusion. He walked down the hallway and found light beneath the guest room door. He knocked once. Grace, a quiet pause. Then the door opened only a few inches. Yes, why are you sleeping here? I thought you'd be more comfortable having your room back. Our room, she looked down. It never really felt that way. Before he could answer, she wished him good night and gently closed the door. Damian remained standing in the hallway long after the light inside went out. For the first time since returning home, he admitted something to himself. This wasn't simply distance. Something fundamental had broken, something he didn't yet understand. The following morning, Grace visited the office of the Moretti family's attorney. She carried a slim leather folder. Her hands trembled only once, when she placed a simple gold wedding band inside. I need these prepared. The attorney looked down at the documents. His expression changed immediately. "Mrs. Moretti," Grace offered a sad but peaceful smile. "I've made my decision." He looked at the unsigned papers, then at the wedding ring resting quietly on top. Outside his office window, Damian's car turned into the driveway. He had come looking for his wife. He had no idea that only one floor above him. The first draft of their divorce agreement had just been placed on the attorney's desk. The morning of Alessandro Moretti's funeral arrived beneath a sky the color of fading silver. By sunrise, the estate had already filled with black cars, security personnel, and longtime family friends. Grace woke before everyone else. She stood quietly beside the bedroom window in the guest room, watching mist settle across the gardens where Alessandro had once insisted roses should bloom every spring. He had loved flowers despite spending his life surrounded by men who believed tenderness was weakness. Perhaps that was why he had understood Grace better than anyone else in the family. She folded the blanket neatly, closed her suitcase, looked around the room one last time. There was almost nothing left that belonged to her, exactly as she had planned. Downstairs, Damian adjusted the cuff of his black suit while staring at the portrait of his father hanging above the fireplace. He had barely slept. Grace had avoided him again the night before. Every conversation ended politely. Every silence lasted too long. He kept telling himself that grief had changed everything. After the funeral, he would ask her to leave the estate with him for a few days. Somewhere quiet, somewhere they could remember how to speak to each other again. He still believed time was the only thing standing between them. He had no idea that Grace believed their marriage had ended long before his father died. The funeral passed in solemn silence. Damian remained composed. Grace remained invisible. Guests assumed she was another employee, helping coordinate the flowers. She preferred it that way. The fewer people who noticed her, the easier it would be to disappear afterward. When the final prayer ended, she placed one white lily beside Alessandro's casket. Her fingers lingered on the polished wood. "Thank you," she whispered, "for believing in us." Then she walked away. Everything that followed happened exactly as Damian remembered from that terrible afternoon. The parking lot, the vintage suitcase, the missing wedding ring, the question he never expected to ask. "Why are you leaving?" Her answer still echoed in his mind. "Because I finally know why you married me." She had shown him the old envelope bearing his father's handwriting. Before he could ask another question, one of the family attorneys interrupted. "Mr. Moretti, the council members are waiting." Damian looked back at Grace. "Please don't leave yet." She nodded politely. "I'll wait. It wasn't a promise. It was simply kindness." The family meeting lasted almost 2 hours. Legal matters, inheritance, business responsibilities, future leadership. Damian answered every question automatically. His thoughts never left the parking lot, the envelope. Grace's expression, the sadness in her voice. As soon as the meeting ended, he excused himself. He walked quickly through the mansion, the gardens, the greenhouse, the chapel. Finally, he reached the front entrance. Grace's car was gone. The driveway stretched empty beneath the afternoon sky. She had kept her word. She had waited, just not forever. He called her. No answer. He sent a message. No reply. Another. Nothing. Damian stood on the front steps with his phone still in his hand. He had spent years believing that patience solved most problems. For the first time in his life, patience felt frightening. By evening, the mansion had become painfully quiet. Guests had returned home. Employees cleaned away the last arrangements of white lilies. Damian wandered into his father's private study. Everything remained exactly as Alessandro had left it. Books aligned perfectly, reading glasses resting beside an unfinished novel. A chessboard frozen halfway through a game no one would ever complete. Father Michael stood near the fireplace. "I hoped I'd find you here." Damian managed a tired smile. "I've been looking for Grace." "I know. She left." "I know." The priest studied him for several long seconds. "Did you stop her?" Damian looked down. "I thought she needed time." Father Michael's expression softened with unmistakable sorrow. "No, Damian." His voice was barely above a whisper. "She needed certainty." Neither man spoke for a while. Rain began tapping softly against the study windows. Finally, Father Michael reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He removed a small leather prayer book. From inside it slipped a folded piece of paper, Grace's handwriting. "I found this in the chapel months ago." Damian accepted it carefully. "You read it. I don't read private prayers." The priest smiled gently. "She forgot it on the pew after praying." Damian unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was a prayer. The handwriting trembled in places. Please give Damian strength. Please keep him safe if he no longer loves me. Help me accept it without bitterness. Damian stopped breathing for a moment. He continued reading. But if there is still even the smallest place for me in his heart, please let him choose me because he wants me, not because he feels responsible, not because someone expects it. Just once. Let me know I was loved. The page blurred. Damian closed his eyes. When did she write this? Almost every Sunday. He looked up sharply. What? Father Michael nodded. She came here every week while you were overseas. Every week. She never prayed for herself, only for you. Damian stared at the folded page in disbelief. She thought I didn't love her. The priest didn't answer. He didn't need to. The truth had already begun revealing itself. Night settled over the estate. Damian walked alone through the gardens where Grace had once planted climbing roses along the old stone wall. He noticed details he had overlooked for years. The bench she always chose at sunset, the bird feeder she repaired herself, the tiny ceramic pot where she grew herbs for tea. She had quietly woven herself into every corner of the estate, and he had somehow allowed her to believe she had never truly belonged there. He replayed every conversation since returning home, every careful smile, every distant answer, every moment he had mistaken dignity for indifference. The realization struck him with crushing force. Grace hadn't stopped loving him. She had stopped believing she was loved. A knock echoed through the silent mansion just before midnight. The family attorney entered the study carrying a polished wooden box recovered from Alessandro's bedroom. This was found in your father's private safe. Damian looked at the brass lock. The attorney placed the box carefully on the desk. Your father left specific instructions. He handed Damian a sealed card. It contained only one handwritten sentence. Open this only after Grace has gone. Damian felt his pulse quicken. Slowly he lifted the lid. Inside lay a thick ivory envelope sealed with deep red wax. Across the front, in Alessandro Moretti's unmistakable handwriting, were words that made Damian's hands begin to tremble. The truth about your marriage must finally be told. Damian stared at the ivory envelope for a long time before breaking the wax seal. The room was silent except for the rain tapping gently against the tall windows. His father had always chosen his words carefully. If Alessandro had written this letter, every sentence would matter. Damian unfolded the thick pages. The handwriting was steady despite the illness that had slowly stolen his strength. My son, if you are reading this, then Grace has already left. And if she has left, it means I failed to stop something I saw happening long before you did. Damian swallowed hard. His father's words continued. This letter is not about business. It is not about our family. It is about the greatest mistake I allowed to grow inside this house. He kept reading, you believe I encouraged your marriage because I feared you would end your life alone. That is not true. I was surprised when you told me you had fallen in love. In fact, I advised you to wait. You refused. A painful smile crossed Damian's face. He remembered that conversation perfectly. I've waited my whole life to meet someone who sees me before she sees my name. Those had been his exact words. Alessandro had laughed. Then don't waste another day. Damian had proposed to Grace the following week. No one had forced him. No one had arranged anything. Every choice had been his. He looked back at the letter. Grace never married you for this family. She married you because she believed your heart was worth protecting. Never allow anyone to convince either of you otherwise. Damian closed his eyes. Someone already had. The next page contained something unexpected. Not a message, a list, dates, handwritten. Month after month, beside each date was a short note. Letter sent, package delivered, flowers ordered, no confirmation received. Damian frowned. His father had been keeping record. At the bottom of the page, one sentence had been underlined twice. Too many things are disappearing. His pulse quickened. He looked toward the family attorney. Did my father ever mention this to you? The attorney hesitated. Only once. What did he say? He believed someone inside the estate was interfering with personal correspondence. Did he know who? No. Did he investigate? He tried. The attorney's expression darkened, but shortly afterward, his health declined rapidly. Damian left the study before sunrise. He didn't go to bed. Instead, he walked through the quiet halls of the estate. For years, these corridors had represented safety. Now they felt unfamiliar. Every servant greeted him with respect. Every employee seemed exactly as they always had. Yet someone inside these walls had quietly dismantled his marriage, one missing letter at a time. His first stop was the estate archives. Boxes of household records lined the shelves. Old delivery log. visitor books, courier receipts. For hours Damian sorted through files himself. He found records confirming that packages had arrived from Europe, books, personal parcels, handwritten correspondence. Every shipment had been signed for, most by household staff, some by security, several by Victoria Moretti. He stared at her elegant signature, again and again and again, always on days when he remembered sending something to Grace. Coincidence no longer felt possible. Late that afternoon, Damian visited the security office. The head of security greeted him immediately. "What can I do for you, sir?" "I need surveillance footage." "What dates?" Damian handed him the list from Alessandro's letter. The officer typed quietly. Seconds passed, then minutes. His forehead creased. "That's strange." "What?" "The footage is gone." "What do you mean, gone?" "The recordings from those specific dates were deleted." "Damned by accident." The officer shook his head. "No, sir. They were manually removed." "When?" "Within 24 hours of being recorded." Damian felt the room grow colder. "Who had authorization?" The officer looked uncomfortable. "There were only 3 people." "Tell me." "You, my father, and Mrs. Victoria Moretti." Neither man spoke. The silence answered everything, and yet it still wasn't proof. Across town, Grace unlocked the flower shop before sunrise the next morning. The familiar scent of roses wrapped around her like an old friend. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. She placed fresh tulips in the front window, watered the orchids, straightened ribbons. Customers came and went. Life continued exactly as it always did. Only now she no longer glanced toward the door expecting Damian to appear. Hope, she had learned, could become exhausting. That afternoon Sophia arrived carrying coffee. "You look like you slept." "I finally did." "And how do you feel?" Grace considered the question. "Lighter, because you left." Grace nodded slowly. "I stopped waiting." Sophia studied her friend carefully. "Is that what you really stopped doing?" Grace looked away. She didn't answer, because deep inside a tiny part of her still listened whenever the bell above the shop door rang. Back at the estate, Damian continued searching. His father's study, the library, old filing cabinets, desk drawers. Nothing. No letters. No packages. No explanation. As evening approached, he sat alone behind Alessandro's desk. His eyes drifted toward an old photograph of the family. His father rarely trusted locked safes. He believed secrets hidden too carefully were eventually forgotten. Instead, he preferred ordinary places. Places no one thought to search. Damian stood. He remembered something his father often did while reading. He would absent-mindedly straighten the row of leather-bound classics behind his chair. Damian walked to the bookshelf. His fingers brushed across dozens of worn spines. History, poetry, law, botany. One volume felt different. It moved slightly. He pulled it free. Behind it rested a narrow wooden compartment. Inside lay a small brass key. Nothing else. No note, no explanation, only a tiny engraved number. At the same moment, across the mansion, Victoria entered her private sitting room. She quietly locked the door behind her. For the first time in years, her calm expression began to crack. She opened the lowest drawer of an antique walnut desk. Inside were dozens of neatly bundled envelopes, everyone addressed in Damian's handwriting, everyone unopened. She ran her fingers across the faded ribbons. Her breathing grew heavier. Then she reached beneath the false bottom of the drawer. From a hidden compartment, she removed a small velvet pouch. Inside rested another brass key. It was identical to the one Damian had just discovered, except for one difference: the engraved number. Victoria looked toward the fire burning quietly in the hearth. Without hesitation, she selected a thick bundle of letters, held them over the flames, and as the first corner of one envelope began to curl beneath the heat, someone knocked unexpectedly on her locked door. The knock came again. 3 quiet taps. Victoria quickly pulled the bundle of letters away from the fire. Her heartbeat remained steady, but only because she had spent years practicing composure. "Come in." The door opened. A young housekeeper stepped inside, carrying a silver tray. "I'm sorry to disturb you, Mrs. Moretti." Victoria smiled with practiced warmth. "What is it?" "Mr. Moretti is asking if anyone has seen the old archive keys." For the smallest fraction of a second, Victoria's fingers tightened around the velvet pouch hidden beneath her desk. "I haven't. I'll let him know." The housekeeper bowed politely and left. Victoria waited until the footsteps faded. Then she looked back at the burning fireplace. No, not yet. Destroying the letters now would attract attention. She returned the bundle to its hiding place, locked the drawer, and slipped the small brass key into her pocket. She didn't realize she had just made the first mistake of her carefully planned deception. Across the mansion, Damian stood before the hidden compartment behind his father's bookshelf. The brass key marked 17 rested in his palm. His father never labeled anything without purpose. The question was simple. What did it open? He searched the study again. Nothing. Then his eyes settled on an antique cabinet that had stood untouched for decades. It contained 30 small drawers, each numbered, mostly used to organize family documents long before computers existed. Drawer 17. His pulse quickened. The key slid into the lock effortlessly. A soft click echoed through the room. Inside rested only one object, a folded inventory written by Alessandro. At the bottom was another handwritten note. If drawer 17 is still here, then drawer 18 will tell you everything. Damian frowned. Drawer 18. He tried it immediately. Locked. No key. Empty keyhole. Someone had already removed it. Father Michael entered quietly. You found something. My father hid a clue. Damian handed him the note. The priest read it twice. His expression slowly changed. Alessandro believed someone would search before you. You mean he expected evidence to disappear? Damian looked again at the empty lock. If someone has key 18, then they already know what you're looking for. Meanwhile, Grace spent the afternoon preparing flowers for a small wedding. She smiled as she tied ivory ribbon around white peonies. The young bride admired every arrangement. They're perfect. Grace nodded warmly. I hope your marriage is filled with kindness. The bride laughed. My fiancé says kindness matters more than grand gestures. Grace paused. Those words sounded painfully familiar. Years earlier, Damian had said almost the same thing, while helping her close the flower shop one snowy evening. People remember how you make them feel, he had told her, not how expensive the gift was. She closed her eyes briefly. Some memories refused to fade. Just before sunset, the bell above the flower shop door rang again. Sophia stepped inside carrying an old cardboard storage box. I found these while cleaning my apartment. Grace smiled. You still keep everything. I forgot I had them. Inside were photographs, receipts, birthday cards, pressed flowers, and dozens of envelopes. Grace froze. Every envelope she had written during Damian's months overseas. All returned, unopened. A red postal stamp stretched across each one. Undeliverable, she stared at them in disbelief. That's impossible. Sophia looked equally confused. I thought he received them. So did I. Grace picked up the oldest envelope. It was still sealed. Her own handwriting covered the front. She remembered writing it during the second week after Damian left. Inside, she had described missing him before the loneliness became unbearable. He had never read it. Her hands began to tremble. If he didn't receive mine, she couldn't finish the sentence, because another thought had already entered her mind. What if she wasn't the only one whose letters had disappeared? Back at the estate, Damian reached the same conclusion from the opposite direction. He spread Alessandro's records across the study desk. Dates, courier receipts, delivery confirmations, missing surveillance footage. Everything pointed toward deliberate interference, but suspicion wasn't enough. He needed proof. The family attorney suddenly spoke. There may be one person who can help. Who? The former estate librarian. Damian looked up. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes retired 2 years ago. She managed every archive before leaving. What does that have to do with this? The attorney hesitated. She once reported seeing Mrs. Victoria removing personal correspondence from the incoming mail. Damian stood immediately. Why wasn't I told? Because Mrs. Hayes withdrew the complaint the next day. Why? She said she had made a mistake. Damian's jaw tightened. No. He whispered the word more to himself than anyone else. She was frightened. It took less than an hour to reach Mrs. Hayes' small cottage outside the city. She answered the door slowly, leaning on a cane. The moment she saw Damian, tears filled her eyes. I always wondered if you'd come. You knew, she nodded. I knew something was wrong. Tell me. The elderly woman invited him inside. Without speaking, she walked toward an old cedar chest beneath the window. From inside, she removed a cloth-wrapped bundle. It wasn't large, but it was heavy. She placed it on the table. I couldn't save them all. Damian carefully unfolded the cloth. His breath caught. Letters, dozens of them. Some addressed to Grace, some addressed to him. Everyone carefully preserved. I hid these before they disappeared. Mrs. Hayes lowered her eyes. I should have told you years ago. Why didn't you? She answered with heartbreaking honesty. I was afraid. Damian picked up the first envelope, his own handwriting still sealed. Then another, Grace's handwriting, also unopened. One after another. Years of love, years of apologies, years of ordinary moments, everyone stolen before reaching its destination. He opened the oldest letter with shaking hands. Grace had written only 3 weeks after he left for Europe. The paper carried the faint scent of dried lavender. I know you're busy. I know your responsibilities come first. But I wanted you to know that I watered the little olive tree today. I think it's growing, just like us. Come home safely. I'll be waiting. Damian closed his eyes. His shoulders trembled, not because of grief, because for the first time he understood that Grace had never stopped writing. She had never stopped believing until someone made sure belief became impossible. Mrs. Hayes quietly pushed another bundle toward him. I think these belong together. Damian untied the faded ribbon. Every letter was arranged by date. His then Grace's, his then Grace's, a conversation carried across years that neither of them had ever been allowed to read. Outside, thunder rolled across the darkening sky. Damian looked at the unopened words in front of him and whispered the sentence he wished Grace had heard years earlier. I never stopped choosing you. At that exact moment, across town, Grace unfolded one of her returned letters. A small folded slip of paper hidden between the pages drifted silently onto the floor. She frowned and picked up. It wasn't hers. It wasn't Damian's. It contained only one handwritten line. If you ever discover the truth, ask Victoria what happened to drawer 18. Grace read the handwritten note again. If you ever discover the truth, ask Victoria what happened to drawer 18. She turned the paper over. Nothing. No signature. No date. Just one sentence that refused to leave her mind. Sophia looked over her shoulder. What does it mean? I don't know. Grace carefully folded the note and slipped it back into the envelope. But for the first time, she looked at the stack of unopened letters spread across the work table. I don't think Damian lied to me. The words felt strange. Only a day earlier, she had believed there was nothing left to question. Now every certainty she had built over the past year seemed to be falling apart. Damian spent the entire night reading. His letters, Grace's letters, then his again. They formed a conversation that should have happened years before. He laughed quietly at stories she had written about stubborn customers who insisted blue roses existed naturally. He smiled when she described a stray cat that had decided the flower shop belonged to him. Then he reached a letter, dated 3 months after he had left for Europe. Grace had written, I know you must be overwhelmed. Please don't worry about me. I just wish I knew whether you're eating enough. I still set 2 cups on the kitchen table every Sunday. Habit is a difficult thing to let go of. Damian lowered the page. He remembered that exact Sunday he had written, I bought coffee beans from a tiny shop because they smelled like Sunday mornings with you. Promise me you'll still make pancakes when I come home. Neither of them had ever read the other's words. Years of tenderness had been buried beneath silence that never truly existed. His grief was no longer only for his father. It was for the life he and Grace should have shared. Before sunrise, Damian requested an emergency meeting of the Moretti family council. No one questioned the order. Within hours, the library filled with relatives, advisors, attorneys, and senior members of the organization. Victoria entered wearing an elegant black suit. Her posture remained flawless. So soon after the funeral, she smiled politely. I assume this is important. Damian met her gaze. It is. He stood beside Alessandro's old desk. In front of him rested 3 objects: the preserved letters, his father's final letter, a leather folder containing estate records, no raised voice, no anger, only calm determination. My father believed someone inside this house had been interfering with private correspondence. Victoria tilted her head slightly. A serious accusation. It isn't an accusation, Damian answered quietly. It's a fact. The family attorney presented delivery logs, courier receipts, security authorizations. Every missing package had been signed into the estate. Every missing surveillance recording had been deleted within 24 hours. Only 3 people had possessed that level of access: Alessandro, Damian, Victoria. Victoria remained composed. That proves opportunity. She folded her hands. Not guilt. Father Michael stepped forward. It also explains why Grace believed her marriage was built on obligation. Victoria's expression barely changed. I have no idea what you're implying. You don't. Damian lifted one unopened envelope. This is the first letter I wrote my wife from Europe. He placed it gently on the table. Another followed, then another, then another. Dozens of sealed envelopes slowly formed a neat row across the polished wood. I mailed every one of them. He looked around the room. She received none. The silence became almost unbearable. Then Mrs. Eleanor Hayes entered the library. The elderly former librarian walked slowly with her cane. Several council members stood immediately to help her. Victoria's confidence faltered for the first time. Mrs. Hayes faced the room. "I owe everyone here the truth." Her voice trembled, but it never broke. "I personally witnessed Mrs. Victoria Moretti removing private letters from the incoming mail." Victoria interrupted sharply. "That's a lie." Mrs. Hayes continued. "I reported it." She looked toward Damian. "The next morning, Mrs. Victoria visited my home." The room grew still. "She told me that if I repeated what I had seen, I would lose my pension, and my grandson would never receive the scholarship your foundation had promised." A quiet murmur spread through the room. Mrs. Hayes wiped away a tear. "I was afraid." Damian crossed the room and gently took the elderly woman's hand. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Victoria rose from her chair. "You have no proof that I kept those letters." "I don't," Damian agreed. "But perhaps you can explain this." He reached into his jacket. The small brass key marked 17 landed softly on the table. Victoria's eyes widened despite herself. Damian noticed. "So you recognize it?" She said nothing, he continued. "My father left instructions leading to drawer 18. Another pause. "You already had the other key." For the first time in years, Victoria failed to hide her emotions, only for a heartbeat. But it was enough. The attorney quietly spoke. "We searched Mrs. Victoria's private office while the council assembled." He placed a velvet pouch on the table. Inside rested the brass key engraved with the number 18. Victoria slowly closed her eyes. The room remained silent. The attorney unlocked drawer 18. Inside were carefully organized bundles of letters, hundreds of them. Some still tied with faded ribbon, some never even opened. Every missing word, every stolen apology, every promise, every chance they should have had. Years of love had been hidden inside a drawer, only a few rooms away from where Grace had lived. Several council members looked away. Others lowered their heads. No one spoke. Nothing needed to be said. Finally, Victoria broke the silence. "I never hated Grace." Her voice sounded strangely tired. "I hated what she represented." She looked directly at Damian. "She made you different. You stopped caring about power. You smiled. You listened. You chose flowers over strategy." Her eyes filled with frustrated tears. "I spent 30 years protecting this family, and one florist changed everything." Damian answered softly. "No, you confused control with protection." Victoria looked around the room. No one defended her, not because they feared Damian, because the evidence spoke for itself. She had not destroyed a business. She had destroyed trust, and there was no inheritance large enough to repair that. The council reached its decision before noon. Victoria was permanently removed from every position of authority within the Moretti family. Control of the charitable foundation she had managed was transferred to an independent board. Her voting rights within the family council were revoked. She would receive only the modest personal inheritance Alessandro had guaranteed every blood relative. Nothing more. No dramatic arrest. No revenge. Only consequences. As the meeting ended, Victoria stopped beside Damian. "You won." He shook his head. "No." His eyes drifted toward the bundles of letters. "If I had won, Grace would never have spent a single night believing she wasn't loved." Victoria lowered her gaze. For the first time, she had no answer. That afternoon, Damian placed every preserved letter into carefully labeled boxes. He drove them himself to Bennett Flowers. The shop door was locked. A handwritten sign hung in the window, "Closed today." He stood there for a long time, the boxes still in his arms. He could have knocked on her apartment door. He knew exactly where she lived. Instead, he remembered something Father Michael had told him after the funeral. She needed certainty, not pressure, not desperation, not another promise without proof. Damian gently set the boxes beside the flower shop entrance. On top, he placed only one note. It contained a single sentence. "These should have reached you years ago." He walked away without waiting for her to open the door. From the apartment window above the shop, hidden behind a lace curtain, Grace watched him leave. Her hand rested against the glass. She wanted to call his name. She wanted to run downstairs. Instead, tears filled her eyes as she looked at the dozens of boxes waiting below. For the first time since taking off her wedding ring, she wondered whether healing was still possible. But one question remained unanswered. When she finally opened the very last box that evening, she found a small velvet case she had never seen before, with a note in Damian's handwriting that read, "I was saving this for the day we renewed our vows." Grace sat alone in the apartment above the flower shop, long after the sun had disappeared. The boxes remained exactly where Damian had left them. One by one, she carried them upstairs, not because she was ready, because she finally owed the truth a chance. The first box contained letters from the beginning of his trip. The second held postcards, pressed flowers, and small souvenirs collected from cities whose names she had only read in books. The third was filled with photographs. Not of business meetings, not of luxury hotels, but of ordinary moments. A quiet cafe in Florence, a small bridge covered with flowers in Amsterdam, an old bakery in Prague. On the back of every photograph, Damian had written only one sentence: "You would love this place," or "I wish you were standing beside me. Sometimes, this reminded me of you." Grace pressed the photographs against her chest. All this time she had believed she had been forgotten. Instead, she had been remembered every single day. The final box was smaller than the others. Inside rested the velvet case. Her hands trembled as she opened it. A simple diamond ring reflected the warm light of her apartment. It wasn't extravagant. It wasn't meant to replace her wedding band. Beneath it lay a folded note. Grace unfolded it carefully. Damian's handwriting was unmistakable. "If we ever reached our 10th anniversary, I wanted to ask you to marry me again, this time with everyone watching. Not because the world deserves to witness our love, but because I wanted you to know I would never hide you again." Tears slipped quietly down her cheeks. Not dramatic, not uncontrollable. Simply honest, she realized. She had spent months mourning a love that had never stopped existing. It had only been buried beneath someone else's deception. The next morning, the bell above the flower shop rang before opening hours. Grace looked up. Father Michael stood in the doorway, holding a small pot of white lilies. "I thought these belonged here." She smiled for the first time in days. "They do." He placed the flowers on the counter. "He hasn't stopped blaming himself." Grace looked down. "I know. He isn't asking you to forgive him quickly. I know. He only hopes you'll read every letter before making your final decision." Grace nodded. "I will." The priest hesitated. "There's something else." "What is it?" "He restored the greenhouse." Grace frowned slightly. "The greenhouse. He said it was the first place that ever felt like home because you were in it." Curiosity won over hesitation. 2 days later, Grace drove to the estate, not to return, only to see the security gates open without question. Nothing had changed. Everything had changed. The gardens were brighter than she remembered. The broken stone path she had once mentioned had been repaired. The old wooden bench beneath the oak tree had been restored instead of replaced. Even the bird feeder she had repaired years earlier had been carefully repainted. Small details, the kind only someone paying close attention would notice. She walked slowly toward the greenhouse. When she opened the door, she stopped. Every flower inside had been arranged exactly as she once imagined, but never had time to finish. Wildflowers, lavender, white lilies, sunflowers facing the morning light. On the center table sat a single envelope. No ribbon, no wax seal, only her name. She opened it. "Dear Grace, I almost came to your apartment 100 times. I wanted to explain everything. I wanted to beg. I wanted to promise that nothing like this would ever happen again. But I finally understood something. You spent years waiting for me to choose you without being asked. So this time, I'll wait. Not because I'm giving up, because love shouldn't corner the person it hopes to keep. Whether you come back or not, thank you for loving me even when you believed I didn't deserve it." Damian. Grace read the letter twice. Then a third time she looked around the greenhouse. Damian wasn't there. He had truly meant what he wrote. He was giving her the freedom he should have given her fears years ago. A week passed. Damian returned to work. He attended meetings, signed documents, visited the charitable foundation his father had built. He also made one quiet decision. Every month, the Moretti Foundation would sponsor local flower shops owned by widows, veterans, and single parents. The program would bear no family crest, only a simple name chosen in honor of the woman who had changed his life. The Grace Initiative, he never told her. He didn't need recognition. He wanted the gesture to exist whether she returned or not. Early one Saturday morning, Damian visited Alessandro's grave alone. Fresh white lilies had already been placed beside the headstone. He smiled. "They're more beautiful than mine." "I know." Grace's voice came softly. From behind him, he turned for a moment. Neither of them moved. There were no dramatic speeches, no orchestra, no perfect movie moment. Only two people who had finally learned how much silence could cost. Grace stepped closer. "I read every letter," Damian nodded. "I'm sorry you had to. I cried through most of them, so did I." A quiet laugh escaped them both, the first they had shared in far too long. Grace reached into her coat pocket. She held out her original wedding band. Damian looked at it, but didn't take it. "It belongs to you," she smiled gently. I know. Slowly, she slid the ring back onto her own finger. I took it off because I thought I was wearing the promise alone. She looked into his eyes. I know now that you never stopped carrying yours. Damian closed the small distance between them. Can I ask you something? She nodded. When our 10th anniversary comes, he hesitated. Would you let me ask you again? Grace laughed through tears. You'll still have to get down on one knee. I was planning to, and you'll need flowers. I know the best florist in New York. You do. She slipped her hand into his. This time neither of them let go. Together they walked toward Alessandro's grave. Grace placed fresh white lilies beside the stone. Damian added a single sunflower. She smiled. You remembered. You once told me hope always faces the light. I did. And you were right. They stood quietly as the morning sun broke through the clouds. No secrets remained. No hidden drawers. No stolen letters. Only truth. Only forgiveness earned through action. Only love that had survived, not because it had never been broken, but because both of them chose, every day afterward, to build it again. As they walked away from the cemetery, their hands remained intertwined. Behind them, the breeze gently lifted the petals of the white lilies. Ahead of them, for the first time in years, there was no distance left to cross.